What's cooking? We're good? Good to go. All right, babies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. Today's video is a relation is as relative in its behavior as it is as its name implies. A relation, okay, as its name implies. In relation to what is included in the dynamic, what is the relationship? In relation to what is included in the dynamic, what is the relationship? So let's read it again. A relation is as relative in its behavior as its name implies. Yeah, because relation and relative kind of like both of them have relate in them. Yeah, one is pronounced relation, relate ion, and the other one is relative. So it's relative versus relation. All right, so relative, right? And I gave myself context, but then I gave it a different video. So let's just read the context and do a video about it later. Where you at in life requires other people's position to show the terrain you can't see and show you where you are stuck. Oh, amazing. Okay, so this is basically I want to say a dimensional map or dimensional or dynamically mapping the dimensions of your reality using other people's positions in order for you to be able to like articulate if this is where they are right now. That means they're in a space that's like that. And then you compare basically where you are to that space. It becomes less of a how I feel towards where I am and more like where I am is in relative to where I want to go and using basically I don't know, like using people's positions as lighthouses. Like, is that the way I want to go, or is this the way I want to go? So the initiation of it was intense enough for me to kind of like explain it differently, which doesn't really explain it. So maybe these are just kind of like one video, or I would actually know if I split them in two, I'm gonna do two. But here it is. A relation is as relative in its behavior as its name implies, in relation to what included in the dynamic, that is the relationship, and then context, and after context, I write video. Where you are in life requires other people's position to show you the terrain that you can't see. And here, basically at the bottom, it's and show you where you are stuck. And here I'm probably using stuck loosely, but that's exactly how I felt the time I wrote this. And again, like I said, everything I write here, man, is literally me telling myself that you need to consider this and think about it. And even if I don't, because like when I write them down, they're no longer on my mind. They're gone. They're there. But what that does is it creates a physical presence, or at the very least, my intentional direction of the writing part allows my brain to be like, okay, so this is something that has to be included in our processes as we see the world. And that effectively changes how I look, regardless of if I thought of it or not. And that waiting of 2-3 months before I come back to this, I also get to reflect on where I am now in comparison to when I write it and how relevant this was from a thought process. That's why you see some videos with me that are very much like intense and talking a bit more consciously and fluently. But other videos, I'm kind of like, you know, what's the point of this? And like trying to think out loud and trying different approaches in order for me to fill the 10, 11 minutes that 11, 12 minutes that I actually do with you guys. So like, it's a new way to reflect on things. Not bad. But ultimately, the relation is relative because if we go back to Vishishdevata Chandas, it's like the knower, the known, and the knowing, basically. Uh, there is a relationship that's between you and something. And the hypothetical situation here is because you have a relationship with something. That means there's a dynamic happening, and then there's a relation between you and that dynamic, which kind of creates a different relationship with your uh, with the way you're observing the dynamic and you. So it's one of those, I think, therefore I am. So the minute I realize I'm thinking, I realize I am. And that's basically like that separation, which is Rishi Devata Chandas. Like, I think, therefore I am. So the minute I start thinking, the minute I notice myself thinking, I realize myself. So the thinking and myself are two different. And me realizing is a different dynamic that basically is realized through that process. So I'm realizing what's the first and the second, and then I'm realizing the dynamic between them, and that creates a completely different like overview, I guess, on the relationship itself. Ooh. Okay, Rishi Devata Chandas apparently explains the universe because the origin of consciousness was like when consciousness awakened that it's conscious. Well, like when you realize that you're there, when you realize that you're conscious, the first thing that happens is the relationship between you and that realization. And in meditation, a lot of people kind of like say that's why you built the relationship, that's why you develop it. The self-reflection kind of allows you to see things and process things and go through things and like get closer to yourself to the point where you were basically like nothing and then you realized you're something, and that created a third thing which gave you a different outlook, and that outlook basically multiplied because you realize that from this outlook you're seeing things differently. So that creates a different relationship, and that different relationship creates a different outlook, and that outlook like, and that's how you basically expand into like pure consciousness. Again, I'm saying it in a much looser way than I think that's how you should be able to explain things. I hope I explained things anyway. But ultimately, a relationship is relative in its behavior and its, as its name implies, in relation to what is included in the dynamic, which that is the relationship. So that when somebody says, I have a relationship with that person, that means there's a certain awareness of the relation between them and the dynamic inside. So a relationship is basically a relation including the dynamic relationship. I had this conversation with my friend in Turkey because any form of ship, right? Friendship, relationship is, and if you look at the at maritime, basically, waters and ships, like there's a port and there's another port, and the more ships are going back and forth from these ports, the stronger the relationship, right? And ultimately, that's what ships are in terms of the actual, like, I think English language, because that's the thing. These are the things that they actually point towards, and they basically these are the analogies used. It's normal for us, but at that point they have no idea. So they go like, there's a friendship because he is my friend, and we have a friendship in between us, kind of like traversing the ports and all that good stuff. And so, in relation to what is included in the dynamic, that is the relationship. So, in your behavior in the relationship, your behavior is relative to the dynamic, which means my relationship with my mother is completely different than my relationship with my father. And it's because my dynamic with my mother is different. So this relativity allows you to understand, like, it's the dynamic that kind of like, if the dynamic changes, the relationship changes. And ultimately, when you're having a decent conversation with somebody, uh, whatever it is, like, if, yeah, let's use people. You're having a conversation with somebody and then you basically make a snarky joke. And if they don't like it, the dynamic instantly changes. And you notice that through the communication that's happening. But again, like if you're talking to somebody, for example, a beautiful woman, and as you're having a conversation with her, basically you sneak a flirt and she feels kind of like shy, or she catches it, or she goes like not bad, whatever it is, however she interacts, that probably also kind of like shifts the dynamic into something new. You can say change the dynamic as well, it doesn't really matter. But a shift in dynamic means that both of us are kind of like aware of the shift, but a change in dynamic seems to be more like, but that's not what I want anymore. This is how it's going on. And we've always experienced it, but we never kind of noticed the relation between us and the dynamic, or at the very least me, I never noticed the relation between me and the dynamic, which actually the dynamic that's happening. Like, how am I approaching the dynamic? Because normally we just get involved with the other side. Again, me. And I think it's stages, right? Like in your life, your life's growth is layered on different stages of observation. And I'm at a place right now where this note itself is kind of pointing, like, because for me, I don't really engage with the person themselves. I engage with the dynamic. Why? Because it gives me an objective approach so that intuitively I'm noticing the dynamic. So if anything about them changes, I'm going to notice how the dynamic changes. I'm not going to be like only focusing on them, because once the dynamic changes and maybe it's not something beneficial to me, maybe it's not something I want to be around. I've went through people like that, man, that are basically intense, that that are very selfish, very self-oriented, arrogant, narcissistic, all these kinds of things. Like there are millions of types of people in the world, and sometimes you just kind of like don't want to be, don't want the same dynamic to be applied to a different intention. Let's say it that way. And that's the beauty, from an objective approach, because if you're looking at the dynamic itself, your relation to the dynamic, then you're giving yourself what I would call like a third eye of seeing the world, like a higher, I would want to call, I haven't called it like that before. I always call it like a three-dimensional, basically, point of observation. And that point of observation is what creates a change. But because you're always monitoring the dynamics, so you're always basically observing from a different perspective. And ultimately, like, oof, I see it all. It's a video, guys. I'm gonna get you the continuance in a bit.